So one of the things I was saying before I paused the video is that you have to make sure when you're asking children to identify prefixes and suffixes that that the prefix that morpheme is really functioning as a prefix in that word. So think about the word until. Well, it does have un in there, right? Which means not, but in until, wait until, un doesn't mean not in that word. So you have to be very clear about what you're teaching, okay? It is important that you teach compounds, prefixes, and suffixes with the most common meanings. And so when you're doing that structural analysis and reading, it's important that you not just focus on how children can break down the word to be able to decode it, but also focus on what it means, okay? You can introduce words in families. So think about the word cycle and motorcycle and bicycle and tricycle and cyclist. I think we talked about that one day in class. You can build a classroom community of word detectives. You can put up word walls. You can play concentration. You can play go fish and match affixes with root words and see what you can make. There's all kinds of ways in which morphemics and structural analysis can work to your advantage, okay? And again, remember, it's not just do they know the word, but at what level do they know it? So remember, it can be just an association. I kind of know what it means because I understand that word in certain context, or I can think of some things that are the opposite of that word. Whereas I have a comprehension of that word, so I can categorize that word, or I can use it in a sentence. But if I really have generational knowledge of a term, then I can, discuss it. I can create activities using that word or complete them. I can apply that word in multiple contexts and with various individuals. So again, we want to think about how, all those different levels of word processing. We have talked about, you have been using the days, many of you working with third graders or above, as a means of assessing comprehension. I just also want you to remember that replacing words and context can also be very helpful in understanding a child's vocabulary and skills and knowledge. So here is another example of that and how it might be scored, okay? Now let's think about our English learners with respect to vocabulary instruction. I want you to remember that vocabulary development is one of the greatest challenges because oftentimes what children don't have is access to all the terminology that's being used in instruction, even though they may be very capable readers, writers, listeners, speakers in their native language. It's the vocabulary that often holds the key to being able to do that well in a second language. Oftentimes we have English learners who may read and word call very well. But remember that if they cannot rely on context to understand vocabulary, it's going to be very, very difficult. And so we have what we call word callers, kids that can pick up the book and they sound like they understand all that it means. I can do that in Spanish because I have an understanding of what it takes to decode words, and I have some knowledge of Spanish phonology. So I can pick up a Spanish text and read away, and you might think, oh, she reads that very well, but I might not be comprehending any of it because I don't really understand that vocabulary, okay? Most children learn vocabulary indirectly. We learn vocabulary when we talk in conversations, particularly with adults or more knowledgeable peers, when we listen to adults read, when we read extensively on our own. Many of you acquired a lot of your vocabulary that way. It's not that somebody taught you every single word that you know, but remember that if I'm an English learner and I'm getting my instruction in English, I may not be having those kinds of interactions in my home and in my community with adults who are English speakers. So I may be learning a lot of vocabulary in whatever language is used in my home, but I'm going to need more explicit teaching of that English vocabulary if I'm going to benefit from instruction provided in English. And remember that a student may be able to define a vocabulary term without understanding it conceptually. You can memorize definitions. I'm sure some of you have done that with respect to coursework before, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can then apply that word well. And so just pre-teaching the term without understanding the concept may not be sufficient. Okay. Word study for English learners needs to include concepts and word meanings, multiple meanings of words. We need to talk about compound words, synonyms, antonyms, homonyms, figurative meanings of words. You know, we use lots of idiomatic speech. It's raining cats and dogs. Imagine if you hadn't grown up with that and somebody told you it's raining cats and dogs outside, and how that might strike you, right? So those are all things that we need to be thinking about. So in terms of word-wise instruction, we need to celebrate what students bring to the party. We need to choose interesting words that they're going to be able to use for meaningful purposes. We need to provide those student-friendly definitions. We need to provide lots of examples that decontextualize the word and where we can understand how it might be used across context. And we have to create follow-up activities that prompt children to interact with those meanings. Pardon me. We need to think about ways to maintain those words over time. Because if I just introduced abolitionist and we read one story about an abolitionist during the Civil War and I don't talk about that word again, that child's not likely to maintain that, right? And then we need to create an environment where kids are aware. One of the things we do here is we learn lots of words.